Hey Jacob, how you doing?
Hey, Kellan. Kellan, right?
Kellen's right.
Alrighty. Hey, doing pretty good. Just got off work. Um, Getting ready for round two of lockdown in California, or in my part of California. So, seen better days, but doing okay generally.
That's good. That's good. We know each other through a mutual friend, Sean Baker. You want to just tell us how you know each other?
Oh yeah, sure. So actually, funny story. Back in college, I was very involved with Model United Nations back here at Cal State Long Beach, which is in the Los Angeles area. So we actually went to a conference all the way in Portland, and it just so happened Sean, who's from British Columbia, his school, he was on the Model UN team too. So I remember we were in a council. In a council, I forget what his country representing was then, but I was Venezuela. And we had just interesting dynamics. Obviously, I won't go into the meeting too much, but anyways, him and I clicked off, and then we meeting ends on Saturday night, and we decide him and another classmate to run around Portland and all the weirdness in that city. Everything from discussing politics to watching people walk it dressed up as bananas. Um, I like to suggest people all go to Portland. And yeah, we've just been in contact since, messaging each other, um, just talking politics, setting ideas, articles, etc. And yeah, that's how I know Sean. And Sean's the one who actually told me about you and sent me your show that you're trying to do and get off the ground. So he told me he'd be really interested if you and I both got into a discussion, both got into a conversation for the show, and here I am.
Nice, nice. So, how does Model United Nations work?
So essentially, the way it works is every school has a team where they go into the conference, and basically, this is how the UN functions. So essentially, you have like the General Assembly. That's the one that passed a lot of the resolutions. But then you have multiple committees, just like every different government. So your school, in my case, was representing Venezuela. So we all trained, got the information, and then one of us went represented Venezuela in the General Assembly meeting. Some of us went to, let's say, the UN Food Program, which is another council. They would go to the meeting. I was on the UN, I might be butchering the name because this was years ago. It was the UN Development Council representing Venezuela, and the topic was, I think, sustainable development, and we were trying to pass resolutions and all that. And within these meetings, you're basically role playing a country. So I am not known as Jacob in these meetings. I'm known as the delegate for Venezuela, and I am, regardless of my views, I am supposed to enact and speak and act on the policies of the country. So, for instance, let's say interesting point. I remember one of the members, Australia, because you form these kind of coalitions in these meetings with other countries that would just make sense in the real world based on the issue. So, of course, a guy, someone who's representing Australia, came up with a proposal that was talking about, getting, investments from international corporations and create more entrepreneurship ideas, etc. I mean, very well written, but I, as Venezuela, because he had his little coalition up with the United States and a lot of the Western countries, I go up to the platform, rip them apart, saying you are just trying to spread colonial imperialism, and the Eurocentric capitalist West is trying to exploit the resources out of our countries, and this is all a sham. That we should put the power back to developing countries. The proper term would be the periphery. And I remember after the meeting, we go out of character. He's like, really? Like, why did you hate my proposal and everything? I said, dude, it's nothing against you. I thought you brought some great points, but I said, I'm Venezuela. I have to treat you as as evil capitalist imperialists, and I have to be like one of the leaders that's going to go into deals with Cuba and also Russia, because that's convenient, because they don't like the U.S. Or the EU or Australia or any of those countries. And yeah, I had really good memories doing that. So hopefully that made a little sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like I mentioned to you, I read your post about George Orwell, and you were criticizing how the right uses George Orwell, considering George Orwell was actually a democratic socialist, you said.
Yeah. So this came up because, I mean, this is recurring. You always get a right-wing pundit in the U.S. bringing up various figures of history, Orwell being one of them. And I think this was brought on by was either Tucker Carlson, Glenn Beck, or Ben Shapiro. One of these guys brought it up within that week. And I've heard this comparison before, and they were just, generally comparing the coronavirus measures to Big Brother, stuff like that. I mean, I could spare your audience. If your audience is interested in politics, they may know the positions, how that goes. And it just, I guess, baffles my mind because, I could go into maybe a brief history of Orwell's political views and everything, and what led him to write 1984.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and it cut me off if it gets too specific because this is crazy history. But Orwell, being a writer by the 1920s and 30s, he allied himself with the Independent Labour Party, which was a breakoff of the British Labour Party. Long story short, British Labour Party was the working class party in the UK, with various factions, but they did pass minimum wage laws, fought against child labor laws, etc. Very popular party, but there are two factions in the party. One was what you would call social democratic, as in they wanted to create social safety nets within British society and everything, create big laws, raise taxes, but ultimately didn't want to end capitalism. Now, what's interesting was the British Labour Party initially, and they only took this provision out, I forgot exactly what it was, in their platform, was eventually they were going to work towards the goal of destructing capitalism, move society beyond capitalism. Under Tony Blair with the new Labour Party, whole different topic, got rid of that. But anyways, this faction in the party, though, going back in the 1920s, was criticizing, you guys are not working towards against capitalism, you're working too much with the Tories of the Conservative Party. The Independent Labour Party was firmly democratic socialists in that they were very reform-minded, what you call Edward Bernstein, who was founder of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. But the idea was you were going to use the legal system to eventually dismantle capitalism. Orwell was was a member of that party. He would write articles in support of that party with those views. And so in Orwell's ideal, because you got to remember this is before the Cold War, Orwell is very critical of some of the news coming out of the Soviet Union at the time under Stalin and everything like that. You also have Leon Trotsky, who forms the Trotskyist faction, which relevant to what I'm going to get into next with the Spanish Civil War. Trotsky being up there with Vladimir Lenin, but purged out of the party, out of the USSR by Stalin. Stalin saw him as an enemy, but essentially the difference was Stalin comes to a point where he says he doesn't want to expand the Soviet Union or spread communism internationally. He believes in socialism in one state. Trotsky, on the other hand, believes that Stalin's authoritarian stature went against Lenin because Lenin wanted to establish a temporary dictatorship. Because the idea was it's called the Soviet Union, because Soviet literally means workers' council, that eventually would transfer over to these small workers' councils. Trotsky claimed you had to make an international revolution, but also make that transfer and control to the workers' councils away from the party heads at the time. Now, side note, Trotsky, though, given some of his authoritarian stances and policies in the Soviet Union, lots of critiques if, I don't know if he would have done that, but side note. So anyways, Orwell, in his eyes, he believes in this very reformist-minded form of democratic socialism, workers' rights. Workers should be not just unionized heavily, but also should practice workplace democracy, as in, it's kind of like a worker co-op. Everyone has an equal share in the company, they make votes, etc. But he believes that is also inevitably tied to a society that has social liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of cultural issues, etc. And he didn't see any contradictions beyond that. To him, socialism and democracy were one and the same in the economic sphere and in the social political sphere. One man, one vote. Women are equal. Anti-racism, etc. And that was his viewpoint, and it was a very popular viewpoint. And so at this time, he's working as a journalist, but wind catches guard in the Spanish Civil War, which I don't know if are you aware of the Spanish Civil War, the history like that?
Just from what I read about Orwell there.
Okay, so give one of your views. I have a BA in political science. I'm not a history expert or a political expert, just an enthusiast who listens to these guys. So if I could be corrected, I might have to be corrected at times. But anyways, so the Spanish Civil War, breaks out in the 1930s between the Republican government of Spain at the time. Which essentially they formed a liberal democracy after, I think, was it before or after World War One, against Franco and the Fascist Party, who declared war on the Republic. And so basically he aligned himself mainly with the fascists, and he aligned with some monarchists who wanted to reinstate the Spanish monarchy, and some very right-wing conservatives who you would not say were fascists, but very getting near that edge, whereas the Republicans were the coalition of center-right conservative parties, centrist parties, liberal democratic parties, social democratic parties, socialist parties, and various Marxist parties, some that were allied with the Soviet Union, some that were allied with Trotsky, and very important, there was an anarchist party in there, which to some people sounds counterintuitive, but so what happens is the Spanish Civil War actually serves as a proxy war before World War II. So essentially, Hitler is supporting the Franco side because he does, and Mussolini, mainly because they're going to help support other fascists in Europe. And then the Republican side is supported by various factions in the world. So the United States and the UK and Russia are sending money to the Republican Army, but also you're getting volunteers from these countries going in. And so the thing with the Republican Army, with the Republican factions, were they're all militias working together based off ideology. So you had liberal democratic militias, you had the official Republican Army, and that you had the Soviet-backed Communist Party having their own militias and all that, and the Soviet Union sending volunteers, and you also, like I said, you had democratic socialist ones, etc. Orwell, being a journalist, and a lot of guys, they don't really know the factions too much, other than that they are against fascism. They are there to save democracy. So this is what drives a lot of these international volunteers from all over the world, including some from India and China. It's a very interesting story. So Orwell goes in. He goes into the region of Spain called Catalonia, which is kind of on the border with near the border with France and all that. And he essentially gets consumed in one of these militias. So the militia he joins is the POUM, or the United Workers Marxist Party, if I am translating that correctly, because it's a Spanish name. And so again, going back to this story, I said they were very much against and had issues with the communist militias that were backed by the Soviet Union. They were Trotskyists. And disregarding maybe revelations of Trotsky's authoritarian tendencies, they believe that there needs to be international revolution, and they were also aligned with the CNT. The CNT are what you would call an anarcho-syndicalist militia. They were tied to an organization called the Federation, the Iberian Federation, the Federation of Anarchists in Iberia. Like I said, the translations are always a bit off. But essentially, their thing was they believed in this form of anarchism where the workers, there's no need for a dictator of the proletariat or a government to come in to seize the government and then give workers their rights. Their idea was the workers should take over their factories, everything democratically run. You do not need a centralized authority. Rather, you create syndicates where this one enterprise will work with this one enterprise, or they'll come together and fund their own schools, etc. And I could get into the minutia of the different ideologies between the two, but essentially, other than disagreeing if there should be a government of the proletariat that should make that transition to the end goal of a class society, the Trotskyists were for that. The anarchists said just skip that, go to the society, go to that. Get that out. A classless society. They've joined forces together mainly because they were against the fascists, but also they wanted to distinguish themselves from the pro-Soviet Communist Party, which they found to be very oppressive. They believed much more on smaller scale, real worker-controlled rights. So Orwell finds himself joining the POUM, and basically the entire book is about his, eyewitness accounts of the war. Very interesting. I mean, just very. You see that he's not just fiction writer; he's a very good journalist, and he writes in a way that is very. You don't have to have a bachelor's degree to understand his work, basically. It's a very, I mean, I can't stress enough how great it is how he gives you a frontline view of what war is like, the boredom in between the bouts of battle. I mean, great. But there's one chapter where he does go into the factions and all that. And then another one, he talks about how essentially the POUM with helps the CNT, the anarchists, take control over massive portions of Catalonia and I think the other province, Andalusia, which he wasn't in that province. And all of a sudden, all authority was gone in these regions. I mean, we're talking about no government. There are no bosses. There is no social hierarchy going on. I mean, people would stop addressing themselves as senor, senorita, Mr. and Mrs., and they would say either comrade, friend, or, just address each other by their first names. All of a sudden, workers took over the enterprises, kicked out their bosses, or they just said, you're one worker, one vote. They were able to work with other enterprises or other these co-ops to trade goods and all that. And for a good 8 to 12 months, depending on the town, Orwell is describing one of the few times in human history where you had a post-capitalist functioning classless society. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, people say, how can you imagine a world where there's no central authority going on? That was it right there. I mean, one of my favorite examples he gives is he's taking a train, and on the train he says there's a first class train, and the rich are too afraid to even sit on the first class because the workers from that train going between the regions, you didn't want to be seen as a rich person anymore because A, your goods were going to be gone, but B, it was shameful to not be equal or anything. I mean, it was what he describes at his core, just a mind-blowing sense of humanity could operate without this notion that we have to structure ourselves, into corporate boards, etc. That authority decisions need to be from the top down. That we could make decisions on a community scale. We also don't need to be like the Soviet Union. We could adapt our needs to our own town. Essentially, though, this only lasts very temporarily. Franco, the way history ends is that Franco and his fascists do actually outmaneuver, sorry, I should take a step back. I will go. Okay, so basically Franco does win, to fast forward, does win against the Republican army. He has a fascist country. By World War II, though, he doesn't back Hitler, and because he promises the Allies he is going to be anti-communist, he's allowed to maintain a fascist dictatorship in Spain until the 1970s. Again, very interesting topic how that happened, but Orwell's disillusionment and what drives him to write 1984 An Animal Farm comes from the fact that when the communist factions backed by the liberal parties, they come in, they seize the arms of the CNT, the anarchists, and the POUM, the Trotskyist militias, and they start arresting a lot of these guys. And at first Orwell's shocked. He's saying, wait, we're on your side. Why are you doing this? And he starts going on different propaganda pamphlets coming down, from the Communist Party side. And what he's gathering is that literally with the backing of the UK government and the United States, the Soviet Union sends money in to put down what is a worker uprising in actual classless society because it goes against Soviet interests in the game of international politics and power. It would be dangerous internally if this happened in the Soviet Union with the Stalinist structure, if workers start saying, we don't need the Soviet Union and the bureaucracy to tell us how to work. We are going to take the actual tenets of socialism and actually run our own factories, not abide by the law, not abide by a secret police, the KG, or anything like the KGB and all that. Very threatening. So, World War II happens, the seedlings of the Cold War start beginning, and Orwell writes 1984, specifically warning of a totalitarian society, mentioning maybe the Soviet Union. But you notice, in the book, he's talking about how there's always switching sides in World War II. Who is the enemy of this big country? Who is not? And you have to wonder, is he talking so much about the Soviet Union, or what is enabling it? Is it the United States in itself? And this perpetual state of these two big bureaucratic powers that one claims to be democratic, the United States, even though there's later on there'd be Red Scares going on in the United States and multiple issues of civil liberties going down the road in the United States, versus the supposed worker state, which claims to represent workers, but, under the Soviet Union, not only to be fair enough, they got decimated in World War II, but you have corrupt bureaucratic officials within the Communist Party who are living a upper middle class lifestyle, while the rest of the population is living, substandard lifestyles, at least in the 1940s. So that's where the critique of 1984 comes from. And I mean, I'm not going to say I could speak for Orwell or the book. I mean, sadly, he died only a few years later after the book was published. And obviously, he's not here alive to talk about current world events, but it just interests me how you would go around claiming, Glenn Beck and these conservatives, oh, Orwell would have supported this because we're fighting socialism. And Orwell, I would suspect, would say, what the hell are you talking about? And it just goes to a further narrative. They don't know the nuances of what led to 1984. They make it relative to that situation. It's so important to know what drove Orwell. What did he think politically? What to write 1984? So then you can make your own judgments. When I hear a guy like Glenn Beck using 1984 in those regards, I'm like, this guy I don't even know if he's read the book, but he does not know the history or can even do a simple Wikipedia search. So that's why I generally made that post, was just because having read Homage to Catalonia and then and also having read 1984, it just boggles my mind, because if you don't know that context of the book, you really shouldn't be making such grandeur statements of what the book is the message of the book is.
Right.
Yeah. But
Awkward pause. I will edit that out. I was just trying to think of where to go from there. Lots of like directions that we could go with that.
Oh yeah. So no, I know what I gave was so dense, and it's like a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, super interesting. It's not that I'm not interested, that I'm not responding. It's just like, okay, so one thing, I'm gonna have to obviously edit this, and I don't actually know which way, like what to say, because I was gonna say something about the fact that I do hear right wingers use Orwell, right? And so, for instance, Jordan Peterson. Okay, and I don't know if he would even consider himself a right winger. What do you think?
Peterson, that is a worm of cans.
Yeah. Right?
So, I mean, I have not read his whole book. I've read articles of his. I've seen his discussions in full, his debates in full. So, what is the book? The 12 Steps to Understanding Life, or something like that? That's the famous book.
12 Rules for Life.
12 Rules for Life. So, my gauge, having read articles and experts, and what he says on stage is he's telling self-help advice, which not bad, not controversial. Make your bed, think more positively in certain situations, take care of your health, etc. But then he's making these outside of his field, because he's a psychologist.
Yes.
He's making these humongous claims, that human behavior, you could use crustacean social hierarchies to compare to human behavior, which would drive a zoologist and an anthropologist mind-blowing crazy, because even, the social structures of humans versus, let's say, bonobos, our closest cousins, very different, and social structures within human cultures and society. I mean, you could say there's a biological imperative that we need to be social, but he's just jumping in, and there's other things where he conflates postmodernism with Marxism, which that would be the topic I would be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You cannot be a Marxist and a postmodernist.
I've heard this, but like I read this book by James Lindsay called Cynical Theories, and it's about how postmodernism, even though it detached itself from Marxism and ended up sort of criticizing Marxism, it seems like it has Marxist roots, and it also there's like anti-capitalism is kind of part of it.
Yeah, because postmodernism in itself, it's really hard, because a lot of these thinkers like to call themselves post-structuralists too.
Yeah.
Because in general, Marxism, the idea is that society is inherently class conflicted society. History moves forward between the social hierarchies battling the classes below them, and we're in this stage of the capitalist class. And inevitably, capitalism, through its contradictions, will collapse under its knees. I mean, that's a theory. You could dig that out. Whereas the postmodernists reject that. They say that that analysis of history and focusing on that economic structure in itself of power doesn't apply to our society. And it comes as a reaction by the 1950s and 60s. You are at a stalemate with the Cold War. US capitalism, Soviet communism looks like it's here to stay, and you don't have this global communist revolution. And it also comes out the fact in the 1960s, you in the United States, you have essentially a huge cultural revolution. The hippies and everything, the new left. The second wave of feminism comes out of this, LGBT rights, big questioning of American cultural norms of the nuclear family, stuff like that. And that new left detaches itself from this working class economic left that stems essentially from Marx theory, even if they are not Marxists, even if they're social democrats, they don't want to take down capitalism. It becomes a cultural war. And that's where the new left and what many would critique the current brand of identity politics comes into play. And the postmodernists are very interested in this and I'm being very general here, cultural plays and how that affects society. Like they reverse back to Marx. Marx says that our society is the way because of the material conditions we grow up in. Whereas Foucault, having read Foucault and everything, Foucault is trying to atomize these various structures of the society, like let's say the institution, mental health, for instance, and psychiatry in its general, kind of taking away from this economic realm of, let's say, a Marxist critique of psychiatry is that issues such as depression and everything are chemically based, but it's due to living within the capitalist world, being alienated from your labor, etc. Foucault is trying to just analyze psychiatry as a form of depression in itself. So postmodernism goes away from Marxism and just, in my opinion, it's very interesting mental games, ideas. I suggest you do read these writers.
I'm just sort of basically familiar, and so I think what people like, maybe people who don't see the nuance so much, are people who are coming from a more right sort of perspective, and they just kind of see it as, well, postmodernists are concerned with power dynamics and there's also the critique of capitalism. So even though it's not quite exactly the same as Marxism, it's related. Like, they see it as being in the same sort of camp.
Yeah, no,
as compared to them, because they're much more, a right. Like, I want to talk about a little bit about like what defines someone who's right wing and what defines a fascist as well. So fascist is someone who's actually anti democracy.
So the first one, you want me to define what's right wing, and then define what fascist is.
Yeah.
So right wing in general comes from, during the French Revolution, the French Parliament is formed, and there's down the middle in the hall, you have more of the revolutionary types who want to, accelerate the French Revolution, or having seized and gotten rid of the church and everything. And then they were on the left wing of those chambers. On the right wing of the chambers, you had the ones who were more conservative, some on the far right who wanted to reinstate the French monarchy, others who, while agreeing to get rid of it, wanted to slow down, saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't seize all the church property, bring back the church. Maybe we should slowly go into this revolution. We shouldn't go all out. And that's where the term left and right wing comes from. So right wing in general, this is a generalization though, denotes either you don't want the progress of an issue or society moving forward, you want to move it slowly, or you want to go back to whatever this idea or this policy was.
Yeah, it seems like if you're farther right, then you want something pre-democratic, like a monarchy, say. And then if you're just conservative, then you basically want to conserve things. You're not so much interested in progress.
Well, that's the thing too, is because right wing's broad, because right wing includes conservatives and fascists. What you were describing.
Right, the far right would be the
Yeah.
fascist, or but um, these people who you said they want to bring back the monarchy. Would
Mhm.
you say that a fascist would be even further right than that?
Yes. Well, it comes down to you have because fascism it morphs, and that's another whole discussion. I go straight to the source, the ideological foundation and main thinker, main theorist that essentially births fascism. Giovanni Gentile. He was the right hand man, the speechwriter to Benito Mussolini, and he's the one who, and I've read it, I have read his works actually translated down to thing, and he basically defines fascism as a rejection both of what were the perceived failures of the socialist Marxist bodies in their project, and also the liberal democracy. So he's talking about the center left liberal parties and the conservative parties after World War One to meaningfully make a better society. He becomes very cynical of that. And he ultimately says liberal democracy attacks socialism on one end, but also liberal democracy generally says you will never get any progress out of it. It will always stifle society. And he's going into the fact that you see so much violence and everything, so much turmoil because there's a loss of God. This is where some people say the Nietzsche connection to fascism comes. Next to no debatable if you've read Nietzsche and everything. It's just he goes into the fact that by the 1920s in Europe, religion is losing its persuasion in society. So he ultimately says, though, what has become identifiable to people? The nation, your identity, your ethnic identity. That has kind of replaced God. This is what gives people meaning, as you saw in World War One. People were willing to die in trenches for their country. And he says that essentially the Marxists are completely incorrect because he says there's always going to be social hierarchies in human nature in general. And he also says capitalism, he also agrees, though, with the socialists, ironically, not ironically, that capitalism, the capitalists, they're self interested. They are not going to benefit the nation. They will screw over the country. So his idea is you have to create an authoritarian government that is not democratic, that is essentially bringing in the corporate capitalist class within control of the fascist state, that the fascist state would then uphold and serve the nation state, bring back the glory days of the supposed nation state's history. In this case, with Mussolini, it was bringing back the Roman Empire, the greatness of the Roman Empire, of the Italian people who could trace their descendants down to the Roman Empire, where, I mean, scientifically you could, but with all the immigration patterns that were going to Italy and the trade, different history. I'm just giving you what
Yeah.
Gentile is saying. And so
When
Gentile,
was he? When was he writing?
this is in the early 1920s, and I could link you to the text of the actual work I'm mentioning. It was the, you guys sound right now. Here we go. The Doctrine of Fascism. This is in 1930. This was written in 1927. It was written in 1927.
Okay.
And I think it's Mussolini was given credit, but he's the one who writes this. And this guy, he's a philosopher actually. Before he comes to the logical conclusion of fascism, and so essentially he says that there's always going to be social hierarchies, but capitalism needs to be reined in. The capitalist class has to serve the nation state, and essentially to make a better society, you need an authoritarian society that serves the nation state above all to bring back the glory days. Keep the lesser classes at least happy with basic economic programs, but also accept the fact that there is some Darwinism going involved, that there's going to be more smarter, more rational thinking people at the top of the country, and this will create a stable society that will avoid the trouble and the chaos, in his view, that liberal democracy and socialism create. And that's the core tenet of fascism. You see all over the internet what are the core tenets of fascism, but it's generally that. And what's interesting to me is that you listen to a guy like Steve Bannon. I'm not talking about Trump. Steve Bannon, the way he talks, I've heard his interviews. He's not saying the terminology I'm saying that way, but the general ideas are coming out to the point where I'm like, this guy has openly read Gentile. And when he talks about policies such as, he's not racist against China, but he wants to bring back America to its glorious days and the American nation state, and that the capitalist class of America needs to serve the American class, but he's not, but he's very much against socialism too. and accepting of social hierarchies, rejecting liberalism, liberal values, saying that no, there is an American nationality, American national culture, rejecting multiculturalism. I'm hearing this. A lot of people on the left are hearing this who have read Giovanni's works and are saying, this guy knows what he's doing, but he's just tweaking this to an American audience, as an example. So that's why it's kind of hard to say Trump's a fascist. You might say he's a sloppy, but the definition, without getting too much American politics, that is the core root of fascism. Yeah, let me send you a link right now I'll send you on Facebook Messenger of this paper, because it's the scary part is you read it and it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how did the government work, like, in a fascist country? Just did somebody take over by force and then rule as an authoritarian and then pass it on to whoever they choose? Is it just anti-democratic like that?
Well, it depends on the country and scenario. So when I talked about Spain, it was a civil war where Franco and the fascists overthrew the Republican government and chased out the Spanish Republican government. In the case of Hitler, notoriously, he legally and democratically got into parliament,
Right.
and through coalitions. And not to say you had the SS, the Nazi militia, going around using physical violence, but to be fair, the communists and socialists, they all had their own militias in Weimar Republic Germany. Just the fascists were the ones with the most guns. But so it's very interesting, because fascism could very much turn up into a democracy. And the whole point, and Giovanni Gentile goes into this, is a fascist could easily take over a democratic institution easily. So, yeah, I don't know.
But so the Nazis, did they stop having elections after they got into power, or?
Yeah, yes. Well, it's when Hitler officially becomes the Führer, when he combines with the blessing of the what was it? The conservative, was it the Christian Democratic Party at the time, or it was whatever the reigning conservative party was in Germany, in Parliament. He took the position of both chancellor and what was the other executive position? Essentially, he fused basically head of government and head of state in Germany, to combine the powers to become the Führer that ended whatever checks and balances you had within the Weimar Republic. From there, he then gets special powers to then start banning parties. First, the communist parties, the socialist parties, and then you get to the Social Democratic Party, which even in today Germany is the main center-left Social Democratic Party. And just except for a couple of, you would say, very conservative allies, it becomes a one-party state, essentially. Nazi Germany does. He has total control of the Reichstag, and from there it gets very fast. And what's interesting about fascism is that, it's always 10, 20% of the country, you would say, in Germany or Italy, and I mean, these numbers vary. I always say, look them up. I'm not a academic source of authority, but essentially, it's more so that the fascists go after kind of these apolitical middle-class types, maybe business owners who are a little socially conservative, but they're not crazy. They don't like the socialists. They definitely hate socialists. Maybe they don't like center liberals, but they're going to want a guy who can materially get things done for them, which Hitler did. You got to remember, the Autobahn was created by the Nazis. Where does Volkswagen come out of? It was a German state-run, I don't know if it was directly owned by the Nazis or it was like a joint venture, but it is a Nazi creation to create jobs, to sell cars, to modernize Germany and build up industry. Hitler is expanding healthcare systems, a social safety net. So he's materially understanding the tactics of the socialists, but he's also feigning on, fears of Germany of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, which these people are much more prone to. And that's the language they speak. They're not going to talk to a socialist like me about class theory and stuff. They're just trying to get by, pay the bills. And they don't like these outsiders coming in. I mean, and that's the thing, is they're not going to be active guys who are going to go on the streets, become SS members. They're going to be more kind of like your quote unquote silent majority types, where they're like, well, maybe Hitler does some crazy shit, but I agree with what he's saying. And that is just a classic tactic of fascists, is kind of this, I guess, unenthusiastic consent, or at least mild, like, hey, well, I don't care if these guys do some bad things for me. It works out just fine.
It also seemed like he had a massive amount of like loyal followers that really loved him, you know, like all the Hitler saluting and all that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It was the cult of personality. He was a very good orator. Same thing with Mussolini, same thing with Franco. He could draw up huge rallies. I mean, there comes a tipping point, obviously, where, you have to do the Sieg Heil salute if you agree with Hitler or not, or
Right, right.
you're getting thrown into a labor camp. But that's the power, I think, to this day, you could say in the US, throwing big rallies like that, it was kind of taboo. Now it's just, regardless of your political persuasion, sends a very big message. I have thousands of devoted people who took time out of their day to watch this person speak, enthusiastically cheer him on. And that's the thing with a lot of fascists, they know how to use media well. I mean, for instance, one of the most groundbreaking documentary movies, the Triumph of Will, it was a pro-Nazi propaganda film funded by the Nazis, and I know to this day in film schools they have to put a thing. We are just using the aesthetics, the way they do the cuts and everything, and the storytelling. We don't want you to ever think that whatever the message of the movie is appropriate one bit. So that's one thing you have to understand about fascists. They know how to use the media better than the socialists ever could. I mean, it is so true that if Hitler were here today, I think Sacha Baron Cohen said this. The Nazis would have masterminded Facebook, Twitter, and quote unquote fake news and the algorithms of how to spread information, how to trigger people psychologically if they did. And that cannot be understated enough. People will argue, oh well, they're looking toward German propaganda, fascism, 1930s. Oh, look how archaic it is. I'm like, that's because that was the effective medium back then. I'm like, you don't think memes today are propaganda? Regardless of your political persuasion, political memes are propaganda posters, dude, of the 21st century. We'll laugh at Soviet propaganda, at Nazi propaganda, etc. But what do you think you're looking at all day? And it's just very normalized.
Yeah. But anyway, I really want to read 1984. I haven't actually read it.
The general premise. You've probably know the premise of the book, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean that's the thing is like the whole security state apparatus. I remember going back to when, I was a kid when it happened, but when I was in teenage years, the Patriot Act was always forefront to. This is like 1984, where the government, and Snowden proved it, they could go into my camera right now and see the conversation we're having.
If they want to, but I mean, when I've heard Snowden talk, it seems like what he was reporting on is that mainly what they do is they just keep record of your location. Like I thought he was saying actually that they don't necessarily read your text or like have records of your actual content of your texts, but they just know so much about you just based on being able to.
Well, that's the thing. It's not like the way we see spy movies or like movies in East Germany where someone's actually listening in the conversation. It's going to be more so they're going to have an algorithm that could access text or everything, or maybe certain terms are running up that would send them to an individual.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting to very advanced layers of cybersecurity going over here, to the point where if they could hypothetically spy on you in the computer. Does it mean they're doing it to every citizen? No. Does it mean they're going to go after leftists?
Yeah, he was saying like there still are laws around it, but there's a disturbing amount that about everyone that they actually do collect, and they, because of I guess after 9/11 or something like that, they changed the laws so that it was sort of more that could be done. And yeah, I mean it was less disturbing actually having him lay it all out for me than I imagine. I imagine it was just they had free access to everybody and you had private information at any time, but they were kind of following sort of rules around it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny too, being as someone identifies as Democratic Social on the left, there's so many leftists who will say they're spying on us. If anything, the police departments on the local level are going after protesters, taking photos. You're talking about the NSA, their big priority really is going after still what they view as Islamic radicals and all that. The only guy looking at radical, quote-unquote, leftists is probably some old dude being rubber-roomed until he gets his retirement pension.
Right.
And also the key thing is too is they're using most of the stuff abroad, not on American citizens. Not defending the NSA one bit, but that's the reality that you can make a spy movie out of. Is kind of just. I mean, it is very important that we know that the government does have power, and those who go into power can use this. But as you're saying, it's not as like direct and as, how do I put it, sinister that they know every move. And if anything, the companies that have the information of every movement have your name and everything going on, dude, it's fucking Google, Facebook.
Yeah, that's true.
And I mean, Google has done work with the NSA and stuff, but Google, I would wager there's a good chance Google has more information on an individual person, regardless if they're a subject of, let's say being a potential terrorist, on just anybody in general.
Yeah.
And but the thing is with Google, we allow it. We get a smartphone and we say, oh, location tracking for Google Maps. Well, yeah, I want Google Maps to work, so fuck it.
Yeah, well, it's worse than that. I'm pretty sure I've given Google permission to listen to my every word and my every conversation.
Oh yeah, I mean Zoom right now. I mean, I know their stock is going up and they are making decent revenue from the enterprise services and all that. But Zoom's plan is to get bought out by a company like Facebook or Google so they can sell the patents. Just because the video conferencing technology and the algorithms they're using is much better than what Facebook or Google currently has. And that's the thing, is that then Zoom is going to be used to start collecting information on us. They're going to offer more free options, etc. But that is the scary part of Silicon Valley, is that it is so profitable. This is kind of like where 1984 goes to also, that it's not so much as that they're trying to cynically oppress us. They're just harvesting data so they can sell us ads, but we're just consenting to it. Again, it's normalizing it, and no one's making it. I mean, now people are making a stink, but if you were following this tech stuff 10 years ago, you're like, oh, dude, they know everywhere you're going. That's why, and it's amazing to me how unaware people are. They're like, that's it, I'm quitting Facebook, and they're not going to track me. I'm going to use WhatsApp. Facebook owns WhatsApp. I mean, that's the kind of world we're in, and it's. I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's so interesting when I see right-winger, your libertarian right-wingers getting paranoid about the government, which rightfully show having this much surveillance, lack of privacy, which, by the way, I could go into China later, the scary shit that they're doing out there. But I mean, you should see what private enterprises in America have. It's pretty scary.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, China, though, I actually saw an interesting video of what they're doing in China. So, aside, they have that social credit system.
Yeah.
So Shenzhen, which is kind of like Silicon Valley, I was watching a report about that essentially it's a center where China is developing its own security surveillance technology. And they're talking to one expat where the only photo they have of him is from when he entered the country for his visa. This guy's from Australia. So in Australia, they have their own version, kind of like Venmo and WhatsApp at the same time, called WeChat. And so one time he jaywalked, and within 5 minutes, he gets a WeChat text saying, here's the photo of you violating a jaywalk violation, and we have now deducted roughly $50 from your account.
Wow.
The AI security AI software that China's using.
Wow, that's crazy.
And that's where they're testing like the newest amount of this stuff. But all they need is one photo from the visa, and they could easily identify who you are.
Yeah, that's straight out of Black Mirror.
Oh yeah.
So, tell me, like, what do you think would be the best social system? So you say you're a socialist, and you say that what they had temporarily there in Spain was good. So what did that look like?
So when I say I'm a socialist and I bring up Orwell as a democratic socialist, he has the general view of mind. He does believe that parliamentary democracy, or in the US you'd say congressional republic, interchangeable. Very, very rare you have a Canadian audience, so I'll use the term parliament as most of the world does. But he does believe in parliamentary democracy, and he does believe that essentially we can make reforms moving past the capitalist society. I personally believe that capitalism inevitably structurally cannot last. There is going to be a new economic system the way forward. One that is less oppressive, that is more equal. The Catalonia story is inspiring to me because it shows that end goal is possible. I don't think we're going to ever get there as a country. Well, there wouldn't be a country, hypothetically. I don't think we're going to get there in my lifetime or in the next few generations. I mean, there's so many variables in the future, and you know, I'm very much keen on how do we get electoral policies that would limit the power of capital, and how would you transfer that power to, let's say, worker enterprises? Another issue, like for instance, you can make laws that make it much easier for people to make democratic workplaces. You can say tax exemptions, worker protections, etc. Laws that would protect unions. I do believe in that model, but where I do break off with what you kind of say the center left, etc., is you see it happen in Sweden that they do get to that point where, interestingly enough, Sweden had a law that essentially was going to force companies to share up small amounts of shares to their workers to the point where the workers would have majority control of the company stock and vote away the private nature of the company. It never came to fruition. Sweden embraces more neoliberal policies away from its social democratic socialist model, even though still very social democratic, a lot of social programs. So I think ultimately the Swedish government moved away to maintain capitalism, but as far as I've seen in every country, even in France and Europe, Spain, etc., where you do have a lot of these social welfare programs, they inevitably get eroded because capital always starts concentrating again, will get involved into the parliamentary system, trying to pay off politicians the way they can, start media campaigns. In my country, you're probably very well aware of campaign finance. It's basically legal to bribe up a politician. You just got to fund their campaign, which again, that's a whole other object. And that's why you see, in the 1950s, the social safety net in the United States was not as strong as Europe's, but it was stronger. Unions had much more protections. Public universities were next to free, and as capital gains control all the way up until the Reagan era, they just start wiping away all these regulations, start cutting social programs, and once they take the money from the social programs, they say, look at how much of a failure it is. We should use a private option. And so that's why I'm very skeptical of people who say we just want to have social democracy, maintain it, and that the powers of capital and capitalism won't go in and try to take away all these hard-won gains and social safety nets that do keep people off the streets, not be homeless, do give children better education, better opportunities, etc. But I'm willing to work with the Social Democrats. I am not what you would call a hardcore revolutionary Marxist. I've studied the histories of revolutions. They are bloody, sometimes necessary in history, but it's not pretty. And you saw what happened in the Soviet Union. And that haunts us to this day, is that the Soviet Union under Stalin turned out the way it did. It was oppressive. You had many socialists and communists abroad who were in denial for years. But there's no way we should support what happened to the Soviet Union, that authoritarian style of socialism. And it has created us such headaches. I don't want to say headaches, but just trying to say, it's changing in the United States now, but if you try to even say a socialist program, people are going to flip out, start bringing up 1984, start bringing up the USSR, and they could disagree with me all they want, but they don't even know what I'm telling you right now. Some of these histories, these other variations of socialism, that, socialism is not some big evil Stalin type character coming on. It's like, yeah, you got a lot more money, everything, you might pay more taxes, but the whole point is we want to just make a better society. There's nothing cynical. There's no power grab from a few people, essentially.
Yeah, socialism has never been a dirty word up here in Canada that I've heard from anyone because, basically Canada's, like, people describe it as a socialist country. It's a very liberal, and, there's always a lot of social programs. We have our universal health care and everything.
Oh, yeah, and it's just funny, too, because even the most right-wing American pundits, not pundits, I should say, American people, they are not going to go against some of these, what you would call socialist programs, like Social Security in the United States. That's socialist. I have to pay a tax all the way up until I'm 62 or 65. It varies depending how much you want to get. And the government pays me money for the rest of my life. doesn't pay you enough to get by. You got to supplement that through other through other investments. But they don't question that. I actually have seen TV shows where they do go into these very right wing part of the United States,
Yeah.
and they will go up and they'll ask them, so do you support Obamacare? And Obamacare, not perfect in my opinion, not that good, but it did expand Medicaid. So they asked this pretty poor family, they say, of course not, I hate Obamacare. And they're like, well, how do you get your health insurance? And they're like, oh, through the Affordable Care Act, I get, Medicaid. And Lady says, you do realize this is an Obamacare policy? And they're like, no, Obamacare is socialism. I'm just getting Medicaid.
Yeah.
And so she tries to describe it. She says, okay, well, you get Medicaid. She says, so you're okay with taking government money to do that? And they said, well, yes, I'm a hard worker. I'm an American. And she says, well, what about other people getting the Medicaid too? And she says, well, I'm just afraid if we expand Medicaid more, we're going to get lazy people to bum off the system, which kind of shows American individualism. But Americans aren't against socialism. They're against the terms and ideas of socialism, even though they are benefiting from socialist programs. And so it's and this is a product going back to Orwell of Cold War education. In America, I'm sure in Canada you guys don't have this. You don't have to pledge allegiance to your flag and say the term one nation under God, which the under God thing was added in the 1950s to differentiate the U.S. being a moral, godly society and the Soviet Union being full of evil, immoral atheists. This is fact. You can look this up.
Yeah.
So, communism, especially for my parents' generation, communism was the root of all evil. If you're socialist, you're batshit crazy. How could you support that? This kind of changes with the millennial generation, our generation, and Gen Z. Bernie Sanders, due to the financial crisis and just, the fact that we are doing economically worse off than our parents, and the fact the Cold War, we have either the oldest millennials, they might remember the Cold War, but they were kids, or like me, I was born after the Soviet Union collapsed. So I'm not inundated with this fear of nuclear war and everything. But, also it's a lot of us are, Bernie Sanders comes in, he's stating policies such as Medicare for all and everything, free college. I don't want to say free college, but taxpayer funded college that's tuition free. And he openly says he's democratic socialist. Doesn't say that too many times on the campaign trail, actually. And a lot of us are like, well, that is socialism. That sounds good to me. I mean, you look at other countries that have these systems, Canada, France, New Zealand. Those are not scary totalitarian societies, at least from my understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally, like all economies are mixed economies to some extent or another. And you have people who are on the right that want to privatize more, and people on the left that want to socialize more, right? And so I had one person tell me, I don't know if it's accurate, but that technically even things like police and first responders and things like that, that's socialism.
100%. You would say municipal level socialism. I mean,
Yeah.
The history of fire departments is fascinating in the United States. I don't know if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York before.
A long time ago. I must have been too young to really understand it, though.
Okay, well, there's one scene where a fire breaks out in, in the 5 Points, the slum, and as the place is burning, two rival gangs who are firemen. You're like, if you don't know this, you're like, why the fuck do they have a fire cart and everything? And they're beating each other up as the building's burning, and nobody's, watering the building. What was happening in New York was the firefighting either in the rich neighborhoods, it was like a private neighborhood thing. You had to pay for the services, insurance. But in the slums, you had these volunteer fire departments that were run by the gangs, and essentially, they would put out the fire, but then they would ask you for a street tax after.
Yeah.
Which usually it would be the landlord who would pay it, not the tenants. And obviously, this created a lot of chaos. There was a lot of corruption in these fire departments. So New York City, I don't know the actual years where they set up the Metropolitan Police Department. By the 1880s, definitely they've had that. And the point was that taxpayer money was going to fund the fire department. It doesn't matter if you live in the tiniest slum or the nicest condo in the Upper East Side of New York. Everyone has a right to get a fire put out and safely, get fire rescue, and you do not have to pay a dime out of pocket. And no one, even in the United States, no one questions this unless
No
you're
one
going to like
questions it.
really small kind of Reason Magazine libertarian circles. But in the U.S., like you could talk to any mainline conservative voter for Trump. So would you defund the fire department and have a private fire department that you'd have to pay insurance or a deductible? And they look at you like you're crazy. Like, why would I get rid of the fire department?
Yeah.
It's just, it's not socialism in America. It's common sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the movie V for Vendetta about?
So V for Vendetta, you've seen it, right?
A long time ago again.
Yeah, I saw it last time we watched it 2 years ago. It's basically Britain is under a kind of totalitarian fascist regime. And essentially, you have this renegade named Guy Fawkes who wants to inspire the people to rise up against this authoritarian government. He kind of recruits this young girl protege, and you know, the film goes into a whole thing where like where it seems like she's being caught and she's tortured, but then it comes out he says, "Oh no, this was all set up to prepare you to fight these like fascists." Long story short, he goes in. He goes into the the Parliament building where the fascists are controlling, blows it up after getting a message on live broadcast TV, and the people come out after seeing the explosion and rise up against the fascist government.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me a little bit more though about perfect socialism, if there was an actual socialist system implemented.
Well, if you want to get strict, in Marxism, socialism is strictly the transitionary phase from capitalism to communism. Communism is a society by default. So, for instance, there technically have never been any communist countries, only socialist ones. Communism is a classless, stateless society where there's no hierarchies, everybody's equal, etc. Socialism is the idea that you are taking institutions and in capitalism and bringing them back to the people, people control. You are deconstructing these hierarchies. What does that socialism look like is very different. I suggest really great economic historian, Dr. Richard D. Wolff. He does a better job of explaining any of this than I do. But essentially, there's multiple types of socialism. The one that the Soviet Union practiced was socialism being the transitionary phase. The idea was that the workers led by essentially party heads, Lenin and everything like that. They call it the Vanguard Party, but too academic and dated. But they would come in and have workers' interest, get rid of and nationalize all industry in the Soviet Union and agriculture, and then control everything from the top down in the interest of the workers. But there's no democracy. That failed. Socialism could also mean the socialism that I believe in, that you could get policies that benefit the working class, working people, etc., make the economy more democratic, more for the interests of the working class, but the working class still participates in it by voting, organizing, etc. There's a third line of socialism you call economic democracy, which is the co-op model that I was telling you about that was kind of practiced by the anarcho-syndicalists, but they were anarchists. So the idea would be that this transitionary phase would be that we are going to try to get not just the government working class run for certain things that, let's say, a small enterprise can handle, like healthcare or something like that, but the workplaces will become democratically owned and ran by the workers. And how that would work out essentially is it would be like how not any like nonprofit in the United States works. You have a membership. Within that membership, they vote for a board of directors. In this case, this would be the managers of the enterprise or the the place that you work at. And the managers or supervisors would be people who are elected like every 2 years out of the body. So they were held accountable to make sure the enterprise runs, but also you would vote them out. Whereas in the United States or any job place, really, you don't really have a say in your workplace. You give your boss a suggestion, but your boss, mainly a lower level or mid-level manager, answers to the top guys, and the top guys answer to the CEO, who answers to the shareholders, but he's one of the major shareholders. And it is very much a thing at work. I mean, yes, you could technically leave, but you're free to starve. But in the workplace, you're basically in a dictatorship. I mean, you have good bosses, there's good dictators, there's bad dictators. Imagine a world where your manager, you could be like, I'm voting you out if you try to harass me at work, if you try to make our lives a living hell. But also as workers, the responsibility of the enterprises too is you're not going to vote away your jobs. You're also not going to vote to hurt your enterprise. So one practical example would be, let's say an economic recession hits or something like that, right? In this model, or let's say industries change. So the enterprise is making less money. So instead of the place saying, okay, we're going to have to lay off employees, everyone would come together and they would say, listen, why don't we all vote that we'll all take a 10% hit in our paychecks, so that way we don't have to fire anyone out of our enterprise. That way, even though we collectively take a hit, people still have food on the tables, no one loses their job. That's how that model would work out. And yes, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be, how do I put it, very messy, but there's real world applications to this model living under a capitalist system. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain is a collection of worker-owned cooperatives that form a bigger corporation that work together, and it's the sixth or seventh biggest enterprise in Spain. Very successful, and like I said, it's all worker control, run democratically.
And it works well.
Six biggest enterprise, six biggest essentially corporation in Spain. You would say. I mean, legally it would be called a corporation, but worker run.
Yeah. So that third one is the type that you would subscribe to.
Yeah, the second and the third one, you would have pushing socialist policies within in a democratic government, and also pushing socialism, or a better word would say economic democracy in the workplace, because that is the form of socialism. You're socializing, making everyone in the workplace all equal. They control the means of production.
Okay. So, but in that system, there's still competitive markets. There's still companies working to compete to produce and sell goods, right?
Yeah. Edit this one out. I just got to stretch.
Yeah,
really
no
fast.
problem.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah,
I was just saying, Zoom is not the best for this. I'd much rather be in person with somebody. It's,
yeah. I'm I'm thinking when this COVID ends, my first getaway, Canada lets Americans back in after the vaccine.
yeah.
I did want to do a mini Pacific Northwest trip where I go to Vancouver, then go down to Seattle, and then down to Portland.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
I was talking to Nick, but yeah, the answer to your question is, so that's the current issue we're facing, is that you would need laws, and like I said, this is all hypotheticals. I mean, if I had time to research more, I would definitely get a lot of this out. And like I said, Richard D. Wolff, professor, expert on this, knows what he's talking about more than I do.
Okay.
But essentially, he would say, first off, on the ground, you need to empower worker co-ops. I already know where I live in Long Beach. There's a professor who has an organization called the Foundation for Economic Democracy, trying to get a community garden that would be filled with employees to be like an actual functionary mini urban farm under that model. And you're starting to see worker co-ops pop in the United States and everything like that. I think you have Winco is all completely employee owned, although still a little more stratified. They're a major retailer within the United States that competes with the likes of like Food for Less and Costco. If you're Canadian viewers, I don't think they'll know what those chains are.
Costco,
yeah, Costco would be a little bigger than Winco store size wise, but so you start to see inklings of this type of thing happening. So the idea is, within a democratic model, how can we legally, again, I've said this before, push policies that would empower some of these worker co-ops? What can we do to do that? Also, let's say you would say, well, I can work at a company that's more competitive. They're going to hire me because I have more skills for more money. You know, like I said, sorry, my train of thought is, I had a long day at work, man.
yeah.
You know, so the idea is with the co-op is you would, you know, it's called the fringe benefit theory. It's like, you could easily say like, oh, I can work at a company, slave away, or at this worker co-op, you say you have agency with the workers, very much like if you had a union job. The benefits are set in play, etc. Like I said, it's open terrain. It's going to be messy, but the first thing is we need to get the idea out there and just look at the examples. So, and like I said, you know, part within the laws, you want to pass laws that would support these guys. Essentially, that would be my argument there. Little, I know a little esoteric. Like I said, I got to find more of the co-ops. I just forgot the names of a lot of these guys.
No worries. Yeah. And so you're basically what you think will happen is that this will increase equality because the workers will have more bargaining power, and so there would be a more equal distribution of the proceeds of the business.
Correct, equal proceeds of the business, and there'd be incentive too to not offshore the business. So, if the workers control it and everything, why would you want to ship your jobs away? Much like a lot of what the auto industry did when NAFTA was passed. A lot of auto plants went down into Mexico, for instance. And that's the thing, is that I think if you give work, people who are workers, more control agency, you go into work and you say, wait, I have a say in this workplace. It's going to make a loads different too in your work, in your output of your work, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like I said, when I learned this stuff too, I mean, it blows my mind. I think this all, because I think it's okay. We might tie it up because I do have to call a friend. I think the big thing I want to tell your viewers is that you don't have to agree with me, socialism. Some of my points I got to even be more educated on. I could be wrong. I'm up for open dialogue like what we're having right now. And what I'm trying to put out there, starting with the Orwell thing, is there's different types of socialism. There's a lot of history behind socialism. When someone calls himself a socialist, you may want to ask them what kind of socialists they are, what programs they do. Don't think of the arm hammer and the arm hammer and sickle flag.
Right.
It's and that there are forms of socialism that have been proven that do work within the framework of a liberal democracy. The socialism that George Orwell believed in. And
the one that you believe in, it fits within liberal democracy?
Yes. The idea that I still believe that a socialist party can win in a system if you don't have capitalist intrusion into the other parties, simply because the ideas could sell. And if socialists deliver on the programs they do, and I'm talking about programs like Medicare for All, like free university. I mean, this is why the Labour Party in the UK is so popular. Was so popular for so many years. They brought healthcare. They brought essentially free higher education. They did the council housing, affordable public housing in the UK, until Thatcher threw that on its head, where she essentially privatized the homes, and people thought they could make a lot of money. Now the UK has a housing crisis similar to the United States. Housing prices are through the roof. Homelessness is going up. But, in the 1950s, after World War II, labor brought affordable public housing, which, unlike the United States, was pretty well funded up until the 80s. It did not have the stigma that it does. So whether you want to call labor a socialist party or not, that's a whole nother debate. But these were socialist policies that won. And the idea is that as socialists, we have to engage in a liberal democratic system, and we have to sell people on our ideas, because we have to believe, and I do believe these are good ideas. They do work. They really do have real world implications. I think what the Soviet Union did was horrible. I think an authoritarian socialism is counterintuitive to the socialism I want. The socialism I want stems from a democratic tradition. And I could get into a whole other video how some of the founding fathers of America, Thomas Paine, for instance, he was advocating for land taxes on big property owners to go for what was the seedlings of what you would now call Social Security.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. But that's just how I would want to end today. And I can send you links to some of the things I was quoting if you want to put that in the video below.
Yeah, for sure. That'll be great. I'm definitely going to look into the things that you've spoken about today, and that's a lot of really interesting stuff for me to dig into.
Yeah. Well, anyways, thank you for having me on. I had a great time discussing all this stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, no problem.
All right, man. Talk to you later. Bye.